Hello and welcome to day 140 of 365 days towards racial change. My name is Tomlins Nyback. We're here talking about black issues in America, the black plight, our hurdles, our successes, failures, and everything in between. Two major burdens oppress my mind as this project goes along. First, um, burden has to do with the mind. Does the black mind of slavery, oppression, vulnerability perpetuate itself from generation to generation? And conversely, does the white mind of privilege, entitlement, expectation of favor, in not just America but the world and all of life prevail from generation to generation among white folks? And the second burden is for financial literacy of all kinds, financial most of all, for us blacks especially, to understand how our money is moving, working, its effectiveness, um, who benefits as we earn and spend it, those kind of things. What's leverage? Is your house an asset or a liability? A lot of those things come up. I'm inspired by a great man, although I've never met him personally. Uh, his name is Dr. Claude Anderson. I want you to get these books because I rely on these heavily. And get this one. If you don't get any book, this will get you started, definitely. A Black History Reader, 101 Questions You Never Thought to Ask, Black Labor, White Wealth, Search for Power, and Economic Justice. And Dr. Anderson's National Plan to Empower Black America, Powernomics. You can find Dr. Anderson at powernomics.com and the Heritage Institute in Washington, D.C. Behind me, you see the hashtag #US2 symbol. Find black women essentially there supporting one another and conversing. There are some definite exclusive issues between the black man and black woman. Go to Black Enough, BLAGGENUF, and that's kind of a black Facebook, big community there. If you can't find your flavor, start your own. It's the information age, the web, and this stuff is free, you know. Shoot, they're using the information to do their demographics and target audiences and stuff. That's why it's free. But anyway, uh, start your own if you can't find your voice. And finally, Uncle Tom's Cabin. We're actually in here today, going to keep moving on in here. Chapter 13, Harriet Beecher Stowe's phenomenal work, written, compiled at least in the mid-1800s. It's actually a series of newspaper articles in an abolitionist paper. And it's fictional life of a lot of people, and it's very interesting. I finished reading it. We just do summaries and reviews here, but it's a good read. Read the book to the end. Don't even wait for me. I might, spoil something for you here. Read ahead, and you're going to get, I believe you'll be impressed with the ending. All right, chapter 13. We've left off, I believe, chapter 12. Tom is on a boat, and some of the lives of some various slaves, some kind of random slave snapshots of some couples. We got a kidnapped baby and all that. See, in the slavery days, it wasn't even kidnapping when the mother was distracted for a moment and then came back and her baby was calling. It wasn't kidnapping for the slave, for it to happen to the slave. All of these gross crimes against black people, they weren't even crimes back then. And even in the South, they had written uh, laws and stuff to protect the slaves, but none were ever enforced. I think they did that to placate um, their northern neighbors, the southern states, but they never enforced anything. Frederick Douglass, he talks in his writings about when he was a slave, he saw another slave get shot point blank in the face with a shotgun and killed, and there was there's no trial. An episode of Law and Order doesn't break out. There's no investigation and the forensics. No, it doesn't happen. How many black lives? Um, we see the callousness in the way black lives are thrown away nowadays. What was the horror of the slave South and the North? The North is guilty too. Now we got plenty of evidence. We're going to have to review some of the North's uh, entanglements with the slave. But don't think that because it was a free North and a slave South that there's a big difference. We're going to find out very soon. There's some simple political reasons and power reasons. The black people were just the stuff of the system that they were fighting over. But there was no, unlike maybe an abolitionist thought where there's moral reasons, some reasons of humanity, um, for having compassion on the slave. Overarching features of the Civil War, struggle between the North and South, are for power, political power, and the I don't know, power position in America. We're going to find that out in another day or two. Some of the times, Kevin, we got kidnapping, suicide, and whatnot, and it's just a bleak scene on this boat that Tom is on, heading southward. Chapter 13 picks up with Eliza. She's with the Quaker family. Quakers are, abolitionist sympathizers. They support escaping slaves on the Underground Railroad. They're pacifists, meaning they don't fight. They don't even fight in wars. Story I read about some Quakers, 3 Quakers, I think during the Civil War, and these 3 men refused to fight, so they would bind their hands over their heads while the troops were out fighting, and blood pressure and some anatomical biological reasons, the hands would bleed and all that. Maybe the bindings were tight, and the commentary talks about blood running down their arms, and this they endure this torture while the other men are out fighting. That's their conviction about not taking up arms. This is who Eliza is with now, Eliza and little Harry. And she's anxious, but she's there's been some space and time now, so some of her fears are assuaged, and she actually, in the text, she actually has some rest there. And then she's encouraged because she hears that her husband is on the way. She's very encouraged, right? That remember, George has escaped as well, and he's trying to find his family. He knows they've headed north, and George is hiding in plain sight as a Spaniard, moving through amongst the white people. He knows how to carry himself. He's not beaten down out on the plantation slave. He's mingled with white folks, and he can move around them freely. He has confidence in the air about him, and it doesn't have a whole lot of issues without around him surrounding that. He does have to be careful. He has an H branded on his right hand, so you can imagine he's wearing gloves or some type of covering as he's out and about. So he's looking now for Eliza and Harry. He contacted the railroad. Of course, it probably wasn't the railroad at that time, but at least he's contacted Quakers, sympathizers, and he's heading to where Eliza and Harry are lodged. There's a lot of commentary of Harriet. She takes liberty. It's her book. It's her, entries. So she takes evangelical side roads, and she segues into the abolitionist argument at times, but she houses those arguments within some dialogue between white members of that society, especially. Although George is very philosophical and he questions the white man's dominance and presumption over the world, and he poses some great questions on that. There's a scene, he's in the chapter, about midway through the chapter, he's seated at the table with the Quakers. And the Quakers are very transparent and honest. They're not putting on airs when they're in fellowship with these runaways and these black people. They have, a good moral compass. They're confident in what they're doing. Everyone is equal. They're not hypocrites. They're not saying, about they'll go to their church and stuff like that, but keep their doors locked. I had to walk to work the other day. Every once in a while, the transportation gets messed up, and it's an hour walk whenever there's a hitch. And I walk by this house, and it says, "Oh, Black Lives Matter." That was a big thing a few months ago. Some of the disastrous seasons black men have had at the hands of white police. But anyway, Black Lives Matter. But I wondered about that home, and I wondered if Black Lives mattered so much, how transparent and how much access do black people have to that space if they matter so much. But not so with this Quaker home, where there's no question. I don't know what goes on in the home with the Black Lives Matter thing. I'm guessing the people in that space are white because it's a neighborhood and it's clean and stuff like that. Got to be real. But not so with the Quakers. They're transparent, and they are they're having an equal time there with George, knowing he's a runaway. They put their family at risk and everything. And so the scene is quite lucid, and the slaves aren't savages that need to be controlled and educated and stuff like that. They're just people, just like everybody else. Finally, kind of outros with the Quaker, young boy, the Quaker's son. I think it's Simeon the Second they call him, and they use a lot of these and thous. She puts that in the text to really emphasize, because the Quakers spoke much like that. Back then, I don't know any Quakers now of the modern day that speak like that. Anyway, the son, he's warning his father, because apparently the father's been caught before assisting slaves, and the father's like, no, we gotta kind of bear our cross and keep trudging forward. And the young man is like, no, we need to resist, retaliate, curse on these slave traders and hunters and plantation owners. And like Uncle Tom, this is an interesting parallel here. Like Uncle Tom, the Quaker father admonishes the young man to not speak evil of his enemies. A lot of religious moral instruction at that point, reminding the child that the child wasn't taught that like that, and there's God above, and God's in control. Those messages come glaring forth. That's Harriet Stowe's evangelical segues, her liberties. She wrote the text, so she can do that. I don't think she's overboard with it either. In some parts, I think she is, but not this time. So, he's instructing his son to be mindful with how he is speaking about his enemies and stuff, because in my understanding of any religious order or path is that there's injury done to self by putting oneself outside of the boundaries established within any religious thought. So the Quaker, he understands that the son is at a risk, eternal risk for harboring any negativity, resentment, and all the like. These things concern the father, so he tries to get the son back on track with this issue. And chapter 13 closes. There's tension there. Because it's at this time it's daylight, and there's tension. With this, especially at the borders between North and South. This is Kentucky and Ohio, and so there's a lot of you can expect. There's a lot of activity between North and South, and trackers and traders, hunters going back and forth, captured slaves, going runaway slaves, running. So a lot of stuff all along the border between North and South United States. So in the daylight, it's not actually safe to move, obviously. You want to move in the nighttime. So they decide to wait till nightfall to move this party along. I can't really imagine it, as vivid as we hear about the Underground Railroad and other places, other circumstances like that. It's still hard to imagine a time like that where people are running away, or to be a free man being black and seeing a slave, a dead slave's condition, and vice versa. And I'm not talking about like semantics, someone strung out on the street, on drugs and stuff like that. That's a kind of slavery. I'm talking about slavery America, where it's permissive, where a white man has control over a black man, you know, and skin color being the only difference between them. Very sad time for the nation. So, you know, while we had abolition, the Civil War, slaves freed, and all that, you know, I'm glad we moved away from that for whatever reasons, you know. We're going to find out, I did some study, we're going to find out it was just politics and power more so than moral right and wrong, or an oppressed segment of society. And that some of the stuff that we're taught in school, you notice that they teach us that stuff in school when we're children, with our very young minds, hearing that with no follow up or debriefing or anything. They lay that on our shoulders and then step off this farce we call a school system that just that teaches us in a way to condition us to serve white power, white entitlement, things like that. It's very sad. You know, you give us enough skills, um, put mental yokes on our brain and on our emotional makeup, um, to control. You know, there's a very deliberate air about that's inescapable, that you don't get around. You know, fortunately, I guess the information age is breaking a lot of those yokes and chains and whatnot. A lot of things are more readily exposed and dealt with. Um, you know, things, you know, I mean, things, even the little things that people seemingly get away with now were just brushed over uh, without the surveillance we have, cameras, and more people willing to speak up and speak out. You know, but there was a time when white folks really had their thumb on the power and pulse of the nation. And, you know, you think about the black folks that lived and died, lived, born into it, died out of it, they didn't, weren't tricked onto a boat from Africa and indoctrinated into it through abuse and control and things like that. And then they weren't, what about the blacks that kind of were at the end of that, with getting their hopes up, but still having to navigate a very complex white system that continued to evolve and place um, traps and encumbrances and hobbled that black community as they try to rise up. You know, my whole my piece of paranoia is about, the white people can make all kinds of laws, declarations, emancipations, amendments, and all that, but it's always going to be structured in a way to keep white interest on top. You know, as black people try to reach for it, the white people just keep moving the bar. You know, so it's like the minimum wage. What a joke that is. With so many other forces here, financial literacy is important, where if you understand inflation and some of the other power dynamics around money, you know that a rising minimum wage is a farce, because you're fighting two things. When you raise minimum wage, you're fighting increased prices, and you're fighting inflation in general. you know, minimum wage. Wow, what a farce. Oh, so much, you know. That's chapter 13. That was, you know, kind of a break, and it's a break in the uh, running that they're at kind of at a rest stop. So it's a short chapter. It's kind of a you know, there's tension in the story. The chapter 13 is a release, a resolution. Uh, it's just a cadence, and we'll see how the story picks up. Whether it picks up momentum, if there's any more heartbreak, we're going to find out a little more as we broach Harriet Beecher Stowe's great, phenomenal work. So that's day 140 out of the way. 140 days under our belt. Let's keep the momentum going. I'm Tomlin's Nyback. There's 365 days towards racial change. Bye-bye.